The war rages in Russia and Ukraine while the Europeans and Zelensky dither. Now, we've been talking about this a lot, but it bears talking about today specifically, just because while there are some talks in Europe right now, in fact, right now today as we speak, there are meetings in Paris where there are representatives of the United States, Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio. There's representatives from the UK, from Ukraine, and of course from France. So they're all talking, trying to see if they can come up with some kind of common position in all of this, try to find a way to end the war. And if you saw our earlier show today where we had Steve Jeremy, we went into some of the more details about why there's so much distance between the Western partners with the United States and Europe and Zelensky, et cetera. Recommend you go and watch that for sure. He makes some great points about why some of the things are. But while they're having these negotiations and these discussions, even among the Western side to try and come up with a unified position, the war continues to rage on. And Ukrainian men continue to die every day, sometimes more than 1,000 in a single day, sometimes a lot more than that. That unfortunately gets kind of lost in all of this, whether you're talking about European leaders who want to push one or other positions about what they think and have umbrage at the Russian side and accuse them of X, Y, and Z, whatever it is, or even amongst the United States and Europe, or amongst the United States and Kiev about what the position is going to be, what they're going to willing to give, what they're not. Ukrainian men are dying every day. And this war is continue on, because it's funny in a certain perverted sense that you have a lot on the Western European side point fingers at Russia and say they're not serious about this negotiated settlement. You have Zelensky expressly saying that very thing multiple times. The Russians aren't serious about a negotiated settlement, or they would have had a peace deal. We offered now about a month ago an unconditional ceasefire, and Russia hasn't agreed to it. So that means that they're the only impediment to this. Well, no, they're not the only impediment. They only agreed to the concept of a ceasefire as long as their terms were accepted, which they have been clear about almost from the beginning of the war, and certainly since June of last year, they've been very explicit about exactly what their conditions were, and that if they didn't have their conditions met, they would simply continue fighting. So the Russians are literally doing exactly what they said, while we seem to engage in all this finger pointing. And I want to run over and show you some of it. We haven't done a tactical update in a while. This is in the Kiev, the Kursk area. And you may remember there was once a very large section of this that Russia had lost to the Ukraine side. And now then you can see that almost all of it's down. There's now only one small little village here, and another small little village down here. Russia has taken another complex just in the last 12 hours. These other areas here are contested. So you see it's literally now just a couple. We have to zoom all the way in. Then you can see it's just a few roads and a couple of belts, a portion of belts of little forested areas there. And then that's it. Then it'll be pretty soon. It could be maybe less than a week before the final amounts of troops from the Ukraine side can be pushed back to their side of the border. But if you look a little bit to the north here, this red line here is the border. So you can see that the Ukraine side still has a handful of troops in this area here. But then you see the line go up in here. This was Ukraine territory. This is Sumy Oblast, by the way, this area right here. And then you can see there's the city of Sumy right there. The Russians started this here to try and cut off the supply line that goes into what had been the big expanded area there, where the Ukraine side had been around the Suja Oblast conglomeration of towns here. But then once this part fell, this didn't stop. So the Russians are continuing to have all combat operations here, which probably are going to be moving toward the city of Sumy here. You may recall a little over a month ago, Putin visited the front line in his famous camouflage uniform, the only time of the war I've seen that. And he specifically told General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian general staff, that he wanted him to establish a buffer zone. So this is apparently the continuation of that right here. My guess is that once the Russians finish taking this stuff off here and possibly in a week or so, that they'll probably continue to move down here. So this is probably only the continuation. Almost certainly it's not going to stop at the borderline. It definitely didn't here. Then you move on down here, and I think we've talked a little bit about in the Belgorod area, that the Ukraine side had attacked, and Zelensky made a lot of fanfare of that about a week or so ago. Well, here's the big fanfare. You see, it's basically this village here, portion of this village here, which is now back under Russian control. Most of it, this is in the contested zone. So only this one small little strip of Belgorod here still belongs to the Ukraine side. And certainly, I've asked many times, what is the value of this for the Ukraine side? So at the cost of God only knows how many hundreds of Ukraine soldiers have died for the temporary occupation of portions of the Russian territory, which yielded nothing for the Ukraine side. And as you see, when you dial back into and look, and just even on a regional, you there's barely can see white dots in the middle of your screen there. Russia still has what was a limited buffer zone that they got more than a year ago now in the Kharkiv area. That's still there, and it's an active dual artillery duel and drone duel kind of situation. The territory hasn't hardly changed at all in nearly a year, but the casualties continue going on because that's an active war zone. In the Kupiansk area, up in the north here, there has been continued. This is the Kupiansk right here. There continues to be Russian advances here. It's again small, but it is relentless and methodical. And so now then you see, in addition to all the red area the Russian owns, all these are new contested areas where they continue to move further and deeper into Ukraine, where they're going to put more and more areas to the extent of that into the east at risk. And if we continue going down the line, you may recall we mentioned the Toretsk area not long ago, where Ukraine tried a local counterattack. I told you that's not going to last. It didn't. So the Russians took that far back, but now then they've added a new penetration further into the Ukraine lines, which will put their troops on either side of that at additional risk, because it's now it's much harder to move laterally when you can't use this road. You can't go across without having to go all the way around and back up in here to get the troops that are down in these defensive positions. So it just really complicates their positions even further. Down in the Pokrovsk area over here, you may recall also about a month or so ago, I told you how the Ukraine side had launched local counterattacks, and they had taken back some of the territory, and they were trying to cut this whole conglomeration off here by penetrating here and from this side here. That was repulsed and pushed back, and so now Russia continues to hold it. Russia, I think since maybe December, they were basically at this point in December, and they have chosen not to push that much further, only to hold what they had and to reject any counterattacks that may come. Then all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, I'm sorry, but you see there's additional Russian territory being taken here. All these areas are where the contested zones are. We get down into the Zaporizhia area, where there's lots of action here. Not long ago, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where Russia added a new band, this kind of darker red, if you can see on the map right there. They continue to operate here. They continue to fire medium-range rockets and artillery into targets down here to hit the tactical rear of the Ukrainian side here, which very often has indicated that they were going to start a large offensive. This is one of the places that Zelensky himself said that there was a large gathering of Russians, that they could be launching an attack into this area here in large numbers. That still has not materialized, but at any point that it could. And so you see everywhere you look, it's a continuation of what we've seen since the end of 2023. So now about a year and a half of just constant Russian fighting here. And as a reiteration to those who say, yeah, but the lines haven't changed that much, they've changed some. That's what you can see on a map, the geographical areas. What you can't see is it's hidden from the West, and that is primarily the casualty counts. The Ukrainian army continues to shrink. It gets lower and lower. And as I've told you many times, and it's an art and not a science, it can't be predicted. At some point, one of these fights here, the Ukraine side may buckle. And they're already running low on ammunition. We know, of course, they're running low on personnel. They can't force enough people into the front lines. Those that get there, a bunch of them end up deserting and leaving the fight altogether. It's an endemic problem that on the Ukraine armed forces, and that's just continuing on to weaken overall the Ukraine side. Now, given all of those facts, the rational thing to do for the Ukraine side, for the Western European side, would be to, all right, let's get this war over with. You see all the trend lines are against you. All this bickering and stuff that's going on in public, behind the scenes, men die every day for a war that can't be won. And we can't discount the possibility that at some point these troops are just going to say, you know what, you guys can bicker and dither all you want to do. I'm not fighting anymore. That hasn't happened here. It has happened in other times in the past, and it may not happen here because from reports that I get also, there are some absolute fanatics on the Ukraine side, and they may continue. They may literally go until they are all, well, not all, but a significant majority are killed or taken captive. Especially if the ammunition runs out or runs too low. I mean, and Russia does start these bigger offensives, then it's entirely possible that could happen. I pray that it doesn't, because those losses are irrecoverable for the Ukraine side. I mean, obviously, self-evidently, once you're dead, then that means you're gone forever from your country. Will no longer have the benefit of your service, and all this heroism and fierce fighting that you've done will be for nothing. There's just this sea of graves all throughout Ukraine, which I guess some may say is patriotic and heroic, but only in the way you feel for the moment, because it comes at a profound cost to the country. Now, heroism is great if it leads to liberation, and sometimes that courage and heroism against all odds can succeed. But even in those outlying cases, if it comes to a point to where mathematics and sheer weight show that it doesn't matter how much courage you have don't have the manpower, the equipment, the ammunition, the infrastructure, the industrial capacity, any of those things, if you don't have it, then continued resistance is not only futile, it's also self-destructive, because this war is going to end at some point, whether a negotiated settlement or because Russia hoists the flag in Kiev because they've conquered the entire country. Don't think that's not possible. One of those two things is going to happen, or somewhere in between, but it will end. And how much more sense would it make for the Ukraine side to say, okay, because the war is going to end, let's make sure we have as many people as we can to rebuild and to recover and to start the process, which is going to be generational, to replacing the losses and getting back to, having babies, having families, and growing the country back. Every day you fight on a losing battle makes the future even harder. Forget about the terms. The terms almost don't matter in terms of who's going to be around to apply them. Who's going to be around in the Ukraine side to even live in these cities? Forget, and where's the money going to come from to rebuild them? Those are all important questions. But if you don't have people to actually live in them, and workers to build, and all the things that have to go along with that, then you don't have a country. And we're moving in that direction right now. Those are the things that are important. That's why I keep bringing this up, because while that's happening on the battlefield, off the battlefield, you have the European and Ukraine leaders just dithering and talking a bunch of, frankly, nonsense. So here was Zelensky about a couple of days ago talking about how almost implying that he didn't even want to play ball with the U.S.
What is it about when Special Representative Witkoff talks about some 5 territories? There will be no NATO. There will be no 5th article. How do we respond to this?
As for the territories, Ukraine is a fully sovereign and independent state, and therefore, all territories rightfully belong to the unitary state of Ukraine, in accordance with international law and the principles of territorial integrity. And you know that for us, these are red lines, recognizing any temporarily occupied territories as non-Ukrainian, but Russian. So, once again, the relevant representatives you mentioned are discussing matters beyond their competence.
If you're in a court of law, or if you're on a TV show and you want to give your position, the other side's going to give his position, the facts don't actually matter in those cases. You can say whatever you want, and they can say whatever they want, and then you'll just go on to the next TV show. This isn't a TV show. And when I just told you about all the people that are dying every day, this is fiction. And it will come to an end at some point. And there will be reconciliation for this. There will be consequences for this. I mean, just imagine, I do this periodically. I have 2 sons. And I was wondering, if my sons were fighting in a war, and the leader of my country was talking like Zelensky is here, and because I have knowledge about how wars are fought and what makes the fundamentals that go into deciding who's going to win it, and it's black and white, clear, radically clear that my side was going to lose, and then my leader continues to fight and sends my son into a battle to where they'll die, I would be absolutely livid. I mean, my hair would be on fire, and I would be doing everything I can to say, stop this pointless killing. And I would be quite angry at that leader. And I got to wonder, I'm actually been surprised and somewhat puzzled that hasn't happened in Ukraine among the family members whose fighters are still alive, whose fathers are still in uniform and haven't been killed. And those that have been, as to why there's, I don't know, maybe it's because they feel powerless. They can't do anything. They can't protest. They'll get put in jail. I guess that probably has a lot to do with it. But gosh, if it was me, I think I would be being a little bit more proactive. And so I've been a little bit surprised that hasn't happened. And we'll see if it ever ends up doing it. But one of the other things speaking of Zelensky, Sergei Lavrov was asked a couple of days ago, what does he think is one of the impediments to finding a solution to this? And you can not like somebody, you can even hate somebody, but you do have to have the willingness to acknowledge reality so that you can keep the rest of your people alive and prevent any more unnecessary deaths. But as Lavrov points out, Zelensky has been talking that he just flat out hates any Russian.
Just a couple of weeks ago, in another interview, when he was asked what is driving him, he said hatred to Russia. The interviewer wanted to clarify to Putin. He said no to all Russians. And this is said by the person who, during his artistic days, was defending the right of Ukrainians to speak Russian. And he said, get lost. Don't even think about touching the Russian language. It's our history. So this is where we are. Hatred is not the best guide.
It's not the best guide, but it can sure lead to destructive actions. And I think that Lavrov is correct. I mean, actually, you don't even have to wonder. I'm not sure what interview he was talking about, but Zelensky was interviewed on 60 Minutes this past weekend, and Scott Pelley point blank asked him, how do you feel toward the Russians? And he said, I hate them. Not 99.99%, 100%, absolutely hate them. Now, he went on to say, but of course, we still have to work with them, because that's what you have to say on there. But when you're telling everybody it's 100% hatred, and then all of your actions are like what we just saw here, then that's the truth. Your words and your actions, when they come into congruence, that's actually what you think and you believe. And then when some of your words are contradicted by your actions, then the actions show what the truth is. And that is the truth. So Lavrov is correct on that. That's exactly how Zelensky views it. And that's why he is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, impediment to having this war come to an end. The killing could have stopped. It could have been prevented from coming at all. It could have stopped in 2022, could have stopped in 2023, 2024. Every year there was an off-ramp. He rejected them all. And hundreds of thousands of men are dead as a result. And even despite that mountain of bodies that's buried throughout Ukraine, he is saying that still to this day. That's his position right now. I saw a video from him, it was yesterday, that I saw earlier this day, where he's continuing just to stay with the same fiction. Russia has to be forced into a peace. And by that, what he means is Russia has to be forced into a peace I want and that I'm willing to agree to. But Russia's just like, yeah, we're not doing that. We're not even considering that. And you see that Russia acts on that whole front line, that 2,000 kilometer from Kursk and Sumy all the way around to the Zaporizhia in the south. They're just continuing to fight, and they're continuing to whittle down the Ukraine army. It gets smaller every single week, folks, because they can't recruit enough people. They can't drag people enough off the streets and then have them trained and capable enough and keep them from running away. They don't have enough to even offset the losses. So they're shrinking every single week. They get smaller, and the Russian side is getting bigger every month. I think I saw one report that somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 per month, they continue to grow. They have more people coming in by 6,000 or 8,000 than they have casualties that head out the other side. You can obviously not sustain that math for very long, and we know where that's going to be heading. And one person who does appear to get the math is President Trump, and who's getting his temper and patience, which is not historically that big anyway, is growing even weaker.
This is Biden's war. This is not my war. I've been here for a very short period of time. This is a war that was under Biden. He gave him billions and billions of dollars. He should have never allowed it. Remember this. This is Biden's war. I'm just trying to get it stopped.
Yeah, and he's trying to get it stopped. And as Witkoff said on Fox News this past Sunday, that he's also looking beyond the war. He's saying this is a dumb war. It's stupid. It should have already ended. But I'm just trying to bring the thing to an end. And he's trying to improve relations with Russia. He's trying to worry about nuclear non-proliferation issues, economic issues, national security issues, all these things. As I mentioned a minute ago, this war is going to end one way or the other at some point or another, either now or probably not too much later, but it's going to end. And Russia's going to be there. We're going to be here. Europe is going to be there. So it makes a lot of sense to say, okay, let's just start making progress on getting this deal off the table. It's bad for everybody, bad for Ukraine. Of course, the conclusion is already known. We just don't know the final price tag on it. Let's start moving in ways that can benefit us. Even if you're somebody on the European side that hates Russia, and certainly there's many of those, you still got to have your own self-interest at part. You still got to say, all right, we got to pursue our national interest. And our national interest is not found in making Russia a permanent enemy at the expense of our economy. So not only do you have the sanctions, which have boomerang effects on the European side, one of the key ones is the energy inputs they had for a long number of years, very cheap, relatively speaking, gas that they got directly from Russia on these pipelines and some other oil products that they were able to get, fertilizers, et cetera, food from Russia, et cetera. Now then they have to get it much more expensive from other sources elsewhere. So it's working against European interests. So you'd think, if nothing else, they should join with President Trump and say, all right, we just want to get this off the table so we can get issues normalized and start getting back to a regular life for everybody. So there's no risk of war's escalation. We don't even have to talk about nuclear weapons anymore. Let's get back to business. Or so you would think. But instead, you have the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, goes the opposite direction.
Well, there will be no normalization of relations with Russia when the war is over. That will not happen. That will take decades because there is a total lack of confidence. The threat is still there. As I said in my speech, even if the war comes to a conclusion, the Russian threat is still there. They are building a war economy. They are spending so much money on defense. They are producing in 3 months an ammunition what the whole of the alliance is producing in a year. We are ramping up our ammunition production. Luckily, we have to. There's no way that we can normalize relations with Russia after the war is over.
Are you kidding me? Why do you think Russia's doing that? Because you and all of your compadres there in Europe and in the Biden administration before this continued to funnel weapons, ammunition, intelligence, training, everything in the world to kill Russians. You have just announced an $800 billion defense package to ramp up your military capabilities, specifically directed against Russia. What do you think they're going to do? See, he's making this comment there that like it's out of nowhere for no good reason. Russia's just doing this and they're a threat to us. So, of course, we have to ramp up our capabilities. Look, there's a whole cause effect back and forth situation. And if you don't want Russia to do that, then don't pose a direct threat to them. Don't provide your ammunition and your weapons and your intelligence capabilities so that this proxy here can fire into and kill Russians inside their country. Just stop doing it. Stop getting back to the situation where we're going to prioritize peace. We're going to prioritize just getting along. Look, there's so much bad blood and hatred on both sides of that deal. I assure you, there's a lot of hatred on the Russian side against the European side because of all that's happened here. All these widows and kids of parents who were killed in a lot of these strikes that were come at the American and European and British, German, etc. All these things in French. They're not just going to forget about that either. So there's a lot of bad blood that's going on both sides here. But everybody needs to understand that the point that we need to get to so that we can all live in at least relative stability. God willing, in the future, you can even get to a place where we can have some peace. But first, there has to be the cessation of hostilities. You have to get the killing stopped so that you can get to relative stability. Then you can start working on these other things. And over time, then things can get back into a good situation. And that's happened. You don't have to look any further than the U.S. and Vietnam. Obviously, we were in long years of war and bloody and bitter fighting, etc. And now you can take a vacation there. Now, we do trade, but we actually do a pretty good amount of trade right now. So it can be repaired. It's just going to take time. But that clock doesn't even start until you first reach a point to do what's rational and end the war here. So you see Mark Rutte there. He's already focused on they want to continue ramping up stuff to on the other end of it. And see, even after the war, they're talking about no normalization. Well, you have the senior diplomat of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, who's focused on not ending the war now.
It is clear that all the member states want peace, and remember, we had 27 countries who supported the ceasefire. Also, Ukraine agreed to unconditional ceasefire already a month ago. And yet we are seeing that Russia alone wants war, because we see the deadliest attack just yesterday, Sumy airstrike over the weekend, it is clear that they are stalling and not wanting peace at all. So the only way to get Russia to negotiate seriously is putting some more pressure on Russia.
Yeah, because the pressure worked so well the first 3+ years of this war. It completely failed, and this is going to be the humiliation. Historians are going to look back on this stuff in the future, and they're just regular people are going to just be in shock of how could these senior leaders be so foolish and be so oblivious to reality. To say that now, after you've done everything humanly possible with the first 3 years of this war, with the very strong association with the United States and the agreement with the Biden administration, et cetera, golly, at what point does sanity finally come in? How far does Russia have to go? How much do you have to have proven to you the reality on the battlefield before you finally stop going after these fantasies and putting policies behind fantasies? I'm not sure. One interesting thing there, she mentioned in that this blast that happened earlier this week in Sumy. Now, you may recall that the Western media just blasted this as another evidence of the Hitlerian top of Putin kind of deal, to where he is just this vicious, vile, evil, wicked man that just fired a missile into a known civilian area that just killed a bunch of kids and a bunch of other stuff. And Zelensky, fanned those flames up a lot. I told you the day that it happened that not many in the West paid a lot of attention, but that there were comments by a Ukrainian mayor in the area, and also one of their members of their Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, that was complaining that there had been intelligence that the Russians were going to attack, because there was a military ceremony going on in that area of the 117th Brigade that had fought in the Kursk area. And according to the Russians, they committed lots of war crimes. And so when they found out that they were going to have a celebration of that, then they were going to come under attack. And it was known. And so these politicians said, hey, don't do this in an area where we have a lot of civilians on Palm Sunday. And they were summarily ignored and said, we're going to do whatever you want. Russia did launch this attack. And then, of course, everyone in the West just discounted what they said. That's not true. But now then, yesterday, the Washington Post published this article that said, in fact, no, that's pretty much what happened. They've got it corroborated from several witnesses, Ukrainian witnesses, that Russian missiles hit the Sumy civilians as the military held a ceremony. So apparently it was in one of these buildings that was in the basement or so. These Russian missiles rained down on where it was. Reportedly, they actually didn't even kill any of the military people, only all the civilians who were on the streets. And that is just an egregious failure of leadership, that you would be willing to have a ceremony that the enemy knows about. You know that there's a risk of them attacking, and you don't even do it on the outskirts of town, but in the middle of the city, to where this kind of stuff rains in, and all the civilians end up paying the price for that. No one wants to talk about that part of it. They only want to point the finger on Russia because they launched the missiles. And to be frank, there is some room to talk to the Russians about this and say, hey, you could have found another way to go on after just a military target as opposed to hitting the city where you knew for sure there was going to be civilian casualties. So I think there's room to condemn Russia on that portion of it. But if you're in a war and you know that they're going to do it, then you have a responsibility on the Ukraine side to not put your own people in unnecessary harm's way and to keep it going. Now, I don't know, you hate to even speculate on this, but some speculate that Ukraine wanted to invite this in because they wanted to show another reason why they shouldn't have a negotiated deal with the Russians. They're just evil and wicked. They would claim that this was just against the civilians only, and so that would upend the negotiations. If that's true, those people need to be taken to jail. Taken to jail. Anyone who thought that it had anything to do with that should be jailed because it's not going to accomplish that. We're in the fourth year of this war. There's almost no more shock value left to be had on any of these things. And the point being that you should be trying to end the war here. You should not be trying to upend any kind of a peace negotiation because that's the only thing that can prevent more people dying, military and civilian. But that's the state of play that we're in today, folks. That's where this is. And I just, my gut tells me that it's not going to change. That Zelensky will not be compelled to do anything. Maybe Trump walks, maybe he doesn't. I'm not sure, but it seems to me that Russia has just made the calculation. We're willing to talk, we're willing to do this, but we expect it to fail, and we're simply going to continue on our plan to just march all the way to the Dnieper River and take whatever we want. I think that's what's going to end up happening here. And I agree for the people of Ukraine. I agree for the soldiers on both sides of the line that are going to have to follow these orders until the war finally comes to an end, just because none of the handful of people who have actual power will do the right thing by them. That is the truth of it. And it is something that we're doing this show because I want to expose all the things that are going on here and where the fault lies, because we care about the truth here. And we care about all human life, especially innocent civilians who were pointlessly put their lives at risk by, in many cases, their own people, much less the ravages of war that goes along with that. Before we let you go today, though, I want to talk about one other thing. I've mentioned a few times that the Biden administration did a terrible job at reading the room. Their military analysis was just awful. Their decisions, both in the Pentagon and within the White House itself, was atrocious and is as much responsible for all this disaster and carnage as the Europeans are today. There's something that was happened a couple of days ago when there was a conference that former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan attended, and the issue of the ATACMS missiles came up, the long-range missiles. Now, you may recall that was a point of contention for a long time of the war, that the Zelensky continued to say he wants these long-range weapons from the beginning. The British ended up giving some with Storm Shadow. There was some rumors that the German Taurus missiles were used. It was never completely confirmed whether it was or whether it wasn't. It wasn't out in the open. But then finally, after the election where Biden or Harris actually lost, after that, like about a week or 10 days, they opened the gates and said, okay, now then Ukraine can use them. Now, at the time, we on this channel here, because we're always about telling you the truth, we told you what that would mean. Well, now then, just a couple of days ago, Jake Sullivan did a little soul searching. And in this conversation here, he says, you know what? Probably didn't have the effect that we thought it might.
I would just say, in closing, that we ended up providing Ukraine with a very significant number of these systems, down to the level where, again, we basically have no more to give. And the idea that they made a major difference operationally in the war has not been borne out by the evidence. So I think a lot has been put on this ATACMS decision to suggest, oh, if only you'd given ATACMS, the war would have turned out totally differently. And yet the experience of the use of ATACMS by Ukraine on the battlefield, I think, suggests that that is not, in fact, the case.
So he's kind of doing a mea culpa there, because one of the accusations against the administration among the war hawks was you should have given those things in larger numbers earlier, and it would have made a difference on the battlefield. Ben Hodges was making that argument almost from the beginning. So he was a big advocate of that as well. And now then they're trying to say, well, I know people said that, but the truth is we see now it didn't. So turns out we were right. Well, here's the thing. You were always wrong. On the day it was announced, I went on this show and said this.
As I have told you since this issue first came up, really, especially back in September, but even before that, that the use of long-range weapons are not going to change the tactical outcome of this war. That is already decided. Ukraine has lost the war. There is no path even to hang on.
And now then you have the national security advisor belatedly going, who knew that it wasn't going to work? We knew. Anyone who understands military affairs knew that it wasn't going to work. I had mentioned all during the months prior to that, when it was first being talked about, I tried to point out the graphic evidence on the ground that the Russian side had been using long-range weapons since at least the autumn of 2022 in a relentless nonstop firing all across the breadth and width of Ukraine, and having tremendous damage on some of their infrastructure, their economic infrastructure, on their energy infrastructure, their military factories, arms depots, fuel depots, etc. That continually kept hitting that stuff, and it never had the tactical advantage. It never knocked them out of the war. Those were thousands of missiles and long-range drones that caused that damage. And now that people were thinking a few hundred or even a few dozens of these American long range would, or even counting in the Storm Shadows, et cetera, was going to make a difference, it was always painfully evident that it was not going to, because that's just not how it works. People just keep having this fantasy that these things are magic somehow, and if we just had more of them, it would have made a difference. And demonstrably, it didn't, because if it was going to work, then the Russians would have knocked the Ukraine out of the war a long time ago. But it didn't. And Sullivan also fails to mention a couple of other things. He did say earlier in that segment, before he got to that portion that we showed you there, that, well, we didn't give it in the early part because we didn't have enough. And then we started making some more of them. We had a bigger amount of them. And so we finally said, yes, you can have them here. And then he said, we sent several hundreds of them until there was no more left to give. That's what he said. What he's now telling you is, our inventory is now very low. And these ATACMS missiles, they're trying to go to a new kind anyway. So we didn't have very many of them as it was. And I doubt very seriously that we made several hundred in the amount of time he's talking about there, such that we didn't go below a certain level. I think it's very likely that we went way below a certain level. And now then it's going to take a long time to bring them up. So we're now, if we get into a war, our capacity has been diminished thanks to the Biden administration. The second thing he didn't tell anything about is, because we let several hundred of these things go, we gave an absolute golden opportunity to an adversary that we may one day end up fighting, the Russians, to figure out how our missiles work, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, how to defeat them. They tried many different things with electronic warfare. They shot them down with their anti-air capabilities, their interceptor missiles, etc. So they figured out what the ranges were, how you can deceive them, where you need to put things to keep them out of the way, et cetera. But most importantly, how to knock them down. Golden opportunity. In the event that we fight against almost anybody that Russia would know, because if we get into a fight with somebody else, i.e. China, I promise you all of this data will have been given to them before. And so our future adversary is already going to be equipped, whether it's the HIMARS system or the ATACMS, because they both use basically the same guidance system. And there's a reason why you haven't heard anything about the HIMARS after the original time it came out. Only a handful of strikes here and there in the years since, because they figured out how to deceive most of those, or electronic warfare, divert them so that they just landed in an empty field or something like that. So our capacity is lower because we don't have as many of these rounds, and their effectiveness of what's left is now diminished in the case that we need to use them. All of those things are probably going to come back to haunt us someday, and I just seem to go right over the head of Jake Sullivan. And I consider that one of the more egregious things. And that's just one. I mean, you can also add the same thing to our 777s, to our self-propelled M109 howitzers, to the Bradleys, to the Strykers, to the Abrams tanks, all those things. I mean, they physically have them now. They have trophies in Moscow at several museums and places. They have paraded them around. I have a great deal of confidence you're going to see a lot of them paraded on the 9th of May on their Victory Day, to our humiliation and shame. But it's not just the humiliation and shame. It's also the ability they have to mine those things for data to figure out ways to minimize their effectiveness in future conflict. These things are going to really cost us. And the longer we keep going on with this, the worse it's going to get. So there is, like I say, the future historians are going to have a field day with a lot of the senior leaders of our country and in Europe, et cetera. And I grieve about what may happen in the future to our own army should we get into a war that we shouldn't ever even be in. But if we are fighting in one, now then because of the past sins, our army is going to be less effective than it would be anyway. And it's going to be a tough fight if we go up against a peer, which we haven't done since Vietnam and maybe even Korea. So it's important to understand this. I want to get this on the table right now so people understand just how bad this war is, and another reason why the Trump administration should get this damn thing off the table right now. Let's finish this quickly and stop the bleeding of our own capabilities, and of course stop the bleeding for the Ukrainian soldiers and all the soldiers that are involved in this. That's what we need to do. Thank you very much. Appreciate you watching this show this afternoon. We will look forward to seeing you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.